Hello everyone. Welcome to another webinar promoted by SoftExpert. Today's event discusses about business continuity. The webinar will be conducted by Mr. Martin Caddick, an independent advisor on business continuity and resilience with extensive experience on this subject. Martin has worked with organizations of all sizes, helping to define and implement their operational resilience strategies. I wish you all a great webinar.
My name is Martin Caddick. I started in business continuity back at the time of the Millennium Bug when I worked for Fujitsu, and I led Fujitsu Consulting's European Year 2000 practice. I moved to Marsh, the insurance broker, in 2005 to rebuild their business continuity team, and I was then headhunted to create and develop a business continuity and resilience team for PwC, Pricewaterhouse, in the UK. So over the last couple of decades, I must have seen my teams deliver well over 1,000 business continuity projects for hundreds of businesses. And I've seen a lot of different variations of good and bad and a lot of change as well. In this talk, I'll be reflecting on all that experience and thinking about what isn't working and what needs to change to improve business continuity. I want to start by looking backwards rather than forwards. If you're going to try and change things for the better, you need to think about where we are now and how we got here. Theodore Roosevelt said, "The more you know about the past, the better prepared you are for the future." And what has happened in the past shapes people's attitudes and perceptions, and that is very true for business continuity. The pictures on this slide represent some of the events that have driven the development of business continuity. I'll be talking for about 10 minutes on this slide just to set your expectations. Let me flag up at the very outset of this just how reactive businesses and government are to disasters. This is not a good thing. Collectively, we're not proactive or structured in how we plan. Where we are today in business continuity is the result of a series of reactive responses, which has left us with unbalanced capabilities. So let me work my way through the history. Business continuity started to develop from the 1970s in different countries, in different ways and for different reasons. So for example, countries like Japan and New Zealand developed plans for coping with earthquakes. Businesses in areas prone to flooding tended to have flood plans. Fire regulations encouraged businesses to have evacuation plans. But these were really incident management plans, perhaps some restoration plans as well. And they tended to be linked to facilities management. They were not true business continuity plans. Perhaps the big exception to this was in the UK, where the IRA bombing campaigns in the 1990s switched from military targets to economic targets, with attacks like those on the UK Stock Exchange, the Baltic Exchange and Canary Wharf. And this meant that London businesses, especially in the financial services sector, started to plan for keeping their business running in the face of direct damage caused by bombs or indirect disruption caused by exclusion areas, as opposed to just managing the incident. But it was the year 2000 bug that really changed everything. Year 2000 was indiscriminately global, and it was something that everyone had to take seriously. And year 2000 highlighted a couple of key things. Firstly, the level of dependency that business has on IT, and not just business, but also the rest of us. We all rely on IT, drawing out cash, shopping, internet services. Secondly, it highlighted the need to prioritize. With year 2000, you couldn't fix everything, and you didn't want to fix everything. You needed to concentrate on what was important. So a good legacy of year 2000 was an approach, the BIA, the Business Impact Analysis, which prioritized our efforts and also systematically inventoried what we needed to fix. Another important legacy was the acceptance of the need for contingency plans, which are what you do if IT or another service is not available. A bad legacy of year 2000 was it placed business continuity too close to IT, with IT often retaining responsibility for business continuity even today. Meanwhile, the lessons learned by London as a result of the IRA activity were not applied elsewhere really until the 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers, which was similar to the London IRA bombs, except much greater in scale and in global impact. And since then, we've seen a steady stream of terror attacks in cities across the world, from Paris to Moscow, from Sydney to London. It's a remarkably long list. I think the impact of these attacks is that any business based in a large city will now recognize the need to have plans that cope with what we call denial of access situations, meaning they need plans for alternative locations of working at home. Plus, they have to plan to work alongside emergency services in their command and control structure. The next scares that changed business continuity were the bird flu scare of 2005 and the swine flu scare of 2009. These threats never materialized to the extent that we feared, but they did highlight to businesses that they rely just as much on people as they do on IT and on premises. So as a result, human resources, HR, and health and safety departments became involved to a much greater extent, and BIA's business impact analysis focused much more on identifying critical individuals or groups. We also saw devastating storms, for example, Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and Superstorm Sandy in 2012. And to some extent, this reinforced traditional business continuity needs like workplace recovery, restoration, supply chain, with the added ingredient of looking after your workforce. So, for example, Rolls-Royce ended up housing many of its workers in the south of the US in factories, in its factories after Hurricane Katrina. They chartered giant transport aircraft to fly down generators to provide power and shipped food and clothing and supplies and toys to help the families of their staff out in what I think was a wonderful demonstration of employer responsibility. What was different in more recent storms, such as Superstorm Sandy, is the growth of social media as a means of keeping track of staff and indeed communicating with them. Many businesses found that Facebook and Twitter proved the best ways to check whether staff were okay and for making arrangements for them. But of course, the possible security and privacy implications of this had not been thought through. And in the aftermath of the storms, the more sensible businesses started to do so. And this reinforces the need for the involvement of HR again, now alongside security and communication staff. The financial crisis of 2008 presented business continuity with different challenges. Few leaders in the financial sector saw the crisis as being in any way related to business continuity, but the regulators certainly saw the crisis in terms of resilience. I know my contacts at the Bank of England were very worried that the failure of an institution such as Lehman's might cause a major sector-wide disruption. So regulation was introduced to ensure that operations that were critical to the sector were able to carry on their business, even if their parent businesses had failed. So this required recovery and resolution plans, or so-called living wills, to ensure this. The process that financial services businesses went through to build those plans was actually very similar to business continuity, and it could have benefited from business continuity expertise. But the work was usually done by teams set up to create the living wills, and they usually ignored the existing business continuity teams. And this is an example of a huge problem faced by business continuity professionals. We are not seen as strategic or high-powered, if indeed we're thought about at all. And the financial services sector today is still left with an unresolved situation, a situation where greater resilience necessitates a better, more joined up approach, and it's still a real concern in the minds of regulators. But the efforts to improve resilience are still seen too often in very operational terms. In other words, mainly in terms of IT and security and compliance, and not in more strategic terms like culture and decision making, which is where the root problems may actually be. And finally, on this slide, we have cyber. And this takes us back to IT again with an overlay of security. The response to the cyber threat has been high profile and expensive, and often driven by national security agencies. The extent of the problem, few businesses escape attack, make it a board issue. It's brought crisis management and communications to the fore and demonstrates how the executive response is critical. I mean, I've tracked share value of firms dealing with cyber crises, And you can clearly see how the share price of those firms is directly affected by the words and the actions of the leadership. And this is a useful lesson. But cyber distorts other forms of resilience. Once again, we risk overdeveloping one form of defense and missing other threats and other remedies that are not currently top of mind. Right. So to summarize and move on, business continuity is reactive. Business continuity doesn't get executive buy-in unless something is seriously wrong, and then the focus is on that issue, like cyber, to the exclusion of building more comprehensive and consistent and balanced capabilities. I wrote out a list of all the shortcomings that we're left with that I could think of. I'm sure that you could probably think of some more yourselves. And I tried to arrange that list under some headings as shown here. And the headings are governance, approach, and image. They are, of course, all interrelated. But let's just run through some of these in a bit more detail. So under governance, we have ownership of business continuity and resilience within the business varies widely. I mean, where does business continuity fit in an organization? We've seen it sometimes sit under IT or risk or security, compliance, internal audit, facilities, HR, even health and safety. There is no conventional place to put business continuity, and it always suffers from a degree of bias depending on where it sits, because the people who manage it see things from their own perspective. An added danger is that business continuity can suffer from corporate politics. So instead of focusing on how to work across protective disciplines, poor governance leads to the protective disciplines squabbling amongst themselves for budget and for influence. Business continuity is not a board concern. Boards are, if you forget the pun, boards are bored by business continuity. It's never interesting to them unless something goes wrong, and then their interest only relates to what has gone wrong and who to blame, of course, and sometimes the wrong lessons get learned. Next, business continuity is managed too low in the organization, and this follows from the previous point. Business continuity managers tend to be middle managers and don't carry enough clout. They're not consulted about big projects or strategies, and resilience is often an afterthought. I remember one international retail client I worked for postponed a major SAP implementation at the last minute because they realized they had no business continuity or contingency plans should the implementation be delayed or fail. And had business continuity been included as part of the project risk assessments, that could have been avoided. Next, lack of consistent investment. Investment is patchy. Business continuity as a function is too vulnerable to cuts and redundancies because it can be viewed as non-essential. And expenditure tends to focus on specific issues that are top of mind, like cyber, like all the examples of the history of business continuity, rather than on creating an overall capability. The problems of governance, which I just talked about, are related to the problems of image, which are, firstly, business continuity is seen as a dull cottage industry. And this is, if we're honest about it, this is often our own fault, because we report on lots of detail and we report on progress rather than relating business continuity to the business. And the tales of woe about resourcing can quickly make it seem that we're building up mini empires of people who do not seem to contribute anything to the business. Secondly, business continuity is seen as operational, not strategic. And many colleagues want to see business continuity stay in its box. What does it have to do with strategy? The answer, of course, is actually potentially quite a lot, because a resilient business can take more risk. And a good understanding of resilience means that you can make better business decisions and get greater rewards. And this is true, but try explaining that to a CEO or the head of strategy. And finally, there are shortcomings with the approach to business continuity, and there are a number of legacy problems here too. So firstly, our plans tend to relate to offices and not business activities. This is a legacy of threats against locations like terrorism or extreme weather. This shortcoming causes a strong tendency to dumb down business continuity because we plan based on operational things rather than strategic priorities. My team at PwC found that the failure to match plans to business needs was one of the most common business continuity audit failures. Next, business continuity planners tend to turn their approach into a repeatable process, a methodology defined by standards, so that they can meet compliance requirements. And this takes the emphasis away from intelligent decision-making at the point of disruption and in its aftermath. And as a result, we overplan and we obstruct decision-making in a crisis rather than helping it. Thirdly, the approach to planning is reactive rather than proactive. We shut the stable door after the horse has bolted. And this is partly driven by a blame culture. We must make sure, banging the desk, we must make sure it never happens again, rather than by a proper reflection on what can be learnt and by a balanced approach to all possible scenarios. And fourthly and last, there's a lack of an integrated approach and response. Business defenses are divided across many functions like HR, facility management, IT, communication, security, risk, and of course, business continuity. But it's not good enough. Too much time is needed to communicate and coordinate without clear direction. Too much time both in a crisis and during the planning process. So there's a lot to contend with. Where we are is not good enough, and it has a lot to do with being reactive rather than proactive. We now need to look forward. We need to understand what we're contending with now and in the future. What trends are making a difference and are likely to continue to do so. Now, I've picked just 3 mega trends that stand out to me, but you all need to think about this through for yourselves and identify what is going to change in your own sector and in your own geography. The first of my picks is, or should be, very familiar to you, but it's still worth highlighting, and that is the trend of globalization and technology. And this is the mix of high-speed connectivity, big data, the Internet of Things, and Industry 4.0. Industry 4.0 is a term coined by the German government, and it's sometimes referred to as the fourth industrial revolution, especially by the Americans. It is the ability of artificial intelligence, or AI, to automate much more, with an ability to self-diagnose and correct problems and react to changing situations. It's the same concept really as aircraft autopilots, or more recently self-driving cars, but applied to industry, manufacturing, and their support functions. I don't propose to describe all the factors in further detail, but their effect is that businesses sit within increasingly complex, interdependent systems. When something goes wrong in complex systems, the effects of contagion multiply the impact many times over. You often have no management control over supply and services that your business depends upon. For example, if you've outsourced your IT or a business service. I can remember one of my banking clients being held responsible by regulators for the failure of an outsourced service. In this case, it was credit card verification. This service was provided by a third party contracted to a business partner, contracted to our client. Our client had no visibility or control over this, but the service was in their name and the regulator held them accountable. When you outsource, you pass management control to someone else, but the risk is still yours, whatever your contracts say. The next point is really important to understand because of all this interdependency, complex systems are far more vulnerable to completely unpredictable risks, so-called black swan events. Such risks in complex systems are foreseeable, but only in retrospect. They're completely unpredictable, both in terms of likelihood and in terms of impact. And because of this, traditional risk management approaches, which rely on likelihood and impact, simply do not work. So a change of approach is needed to prepare for the unexpected and unpredictable, an updated approach that has at least the 2 following features. Firstly, an approach for working with partners in the network to understand each of your responsibilities and the limits to which that extends. And that means pooling knowledge, and that means joint planning. Secondly, an approach that focuses less on specific risks and more on the capability to respond come what may. I'm talking about the ability to make well-informed, on-the-fly decisions instead of relying on predefined detailed plans. It's not that detailed planning is wrong, but it's like Eisenhower said. He said, in preparing for battle, I've always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. So good planning enables good decision making, but it is not a substitute for it. The technical revolution is not all bad news. I mean, big data and AI in particular offer the opportunity to identify indicators and trends early and to respond early to prevent a disaster occurring. The best analogy for this is an autopilot which monitors all the controls and the status of an aircraft and stops it from stalling and maintains its trim, leaving the pilots to deal with executive and completely left field events. And that's what 21st century resilient systems should be doing. Right, next slide. The second of my picks relates to the balance between relatively random accidents and deliberately targeted acts that cause disruption. To be honest, both have always existed, and I'm not certain that they are proportionally more deliberate acts than there ever used to be. But I do think that business continuity and indeed the risk industry has historically focused on the accident side. Floods, fires, IT failures, utility failures, these are all largely accidental and random, but collectively they are actually relatively predictable, both in terms of likelihood and impact. And the insurance industry covers these well. So without being complacent, because these are still very real threats, they are comparatively obvious, relatively predictable, and we have tried and tested responses. By contrast, the interconnectivity and technology we've just been talking about has attracted the interest of criminals, of activists, and even governments as opportunity to target specific businesses. This sort of disruption, by its very nature, is initially hidden from us, and it is designed to exploit weaknesses in our ability to recognize it and to respond. And these threats are therefore less predictable, and we have to find new ways to protect ourselves, to detect the attacks and to respond. The prescription for dealing with this, though, is the same as before, and that is, firstly, focus on the capability to respond, come what may. Secondly, work with your partners in a network, joint planning. And thirdly, the use of big data and AI to automate early warnings and response. So the next slide, the third and last of my picks, relates to regulation and expectations. There's a sort of negative cycle of reaction in the aftermath of a disaster, whether it's something like the Grenfell Tower fire in London or the 2008 financial crisis or terrorist attacks. And that cycle is, firstly, something goes wrong and there's an outcry, and there's usually something of a witch hunt. The cry is, who should we blame? And politicians and leaders then say, this must never happen again. And then regulators and legislators draw up new rules that mandate approved behaviours and processes. But these often go too far and even become counterproductive. And then everyone becomes obsessed with compliance to the new regulations, rather than making sure that the right decisions get made next time at the right time. Do you think that this cycle makes future incidents more or less likely? I think it makes them more likely. I think you are taking away the element of judgment and replacing it with rules. Most serious incidents I can think of are caused or made worse by failures to follow process because people have switched off their minds, combined with false compliance, in other words, complacency induced by inaccurate or inadequate reporting. My team investigated some serious IT outages that caused major disruption to trade, very serious disruption, and found that on the one hand, a key part of the problem was false green reporting because people were afraid of telling the truth. And on the other hand, worse problems were averted because a few individuals made some brave decisions that were not in the rule book. And I believe the same was true for the Fukushima nuclear disaster, where the manager on the spot acted beyond his authority in getting helicopters in to drop water on the overheating reactors, again averting a greater disaster, but that wasn't in the rule book. The great problem of our times, I think, is too great a focus and reliance on compliance. Compliance to regulation is not resilience. Many regulators actually have a more sophisticated understanding of the issues than we give them credit for. Many recognize that not only is there too much regulation, but also whenever regulations are introduced, businesses fixate on compliance with the letter of the law rather than taking on board the objective of the regulation to the detriment of their decision making. So some regulators have settled on a question-led approach rather than explicit regulation. They try to drive accountability and thoughtfulness by requiring the leadership of businesses to respond to questionnaires and then feeding back their commentary on to the leadership. But trying to guide our response this way is like trying to thread a needle wearing boxing gloves and welding goggles. Personally, I would recommend that you try and build a constructive dialogue with any relevant regulators and not see them as the enemy. We need to note the power of social media nowadays. It was initially perhaps an incredibly powerful way of exposing the truth. I welcomed it for that reason. But it is now an equally powerful tool for disinformation used to feed the fears and prejudices of the credulous, and it can work against you even if you've done nothing wrong. How this will evolve, I can't tell, but we need to understand that it acts as a multiplier in terms of impact. Regulation and legislation is often driven by public reaction, which evolves far more quickly and unpredictably now with social media. In general terms, the first time an incident happens, there's a degree of understanding and forgiveness for the public, an attitude of, there but for the grace of God go I. But if this is not the first time it has happened, that understanding can evaporate very quickly because expectations are higher. For example, BP faced far more criticism in the US after the Gulf drilling rig disaster because there have been previous fatal accidents in the Texas operations. And the criticism of the authorities after the Grenfell fire disaster, which was apparently caused by cladding, was much greater because previously there'd been a number of other high-profile and disastrous fires also attributed to cladding. And when you add malicious intent into the mix, like some of the Russian fake postings on Twitter following the Manchester bombing, you can get a very unpredictable and combustible situation which, when applied to a business, could quickly spiral out of control for you. So, if we are agreed that we are not where we want to be, what can we, as business continuity professionals, do about it? I think that broadly, there are two courses of action. Firstly, if you believe that our role and influence is constrained and is going to stay that way, and that we will never have the opportunity to solve the bigger issues, and perhaps nor should we, then the question is how we can do what we already do better and in a more relevant way. Or secondly, if you believe that we can redefine our roles and persuade our leadership to redefine their approach, then what can we do that is different? So let's look, get the right side. Let's look at doing what we already do better. This is particularly for those of us who believe that business continuity professionals are not, nor will ever be, anything more than a specialized risk mitigation function. Those who believe that we just need to make sure that we play our part as well as we can. And bearing in mind everything we looked at before, I think there are 4 areas that we should be concentrating on. And these are planning for the unexpected, raising the profile of business continuity, working better with others, and getting our priorities right. In fact, this applies to everyone, not just to people who want to stick to traditional business continuity. So what do we actually need to do? So firstly, anticipate disruption better. We can do this by improving horizon scanning, which can be done by picking intelligent key indicators or by gathering intelligence from other departments who are likely to see emerging problems before we do, and also by taking time out to think about what's going on now and in the future, maybe by team brainstorming sessions, or better still, brainstorming with other departments and partners. Secondly, we can focus on building capability. Just following a process that ends up with detailed plans is not good enough. We depend on the capability of people to understand their roles in crises and who are able to make good decisions in crises. And this means training and exercises and using scenarios that are different and challenging assumptions. And this is more important than detailed plans. Next, we need to improve our reporting. Reports should be seen at the risk committee level at least. But to do that and to stay on their agenda, we need to make sure that our reports are relevant. We need to avoid excessive detail. The reports need to be relevant to business operations. And most of all, the reports must give a true picture of the ability of the business to withstand and recover from a crisis, rather than being some kind of program progress report. Talking about making reports relevant to the business, that means having conversations with the business, trying to understand their issues and challenges, and adapting our approach so that it's more relevant to them. The business is a great source of war stories as well, which we need to capture, including where business continuities help them. But we need to avoid scaremongering, which can work in the short term, but undermines your credibility in the longer term. During both year 2000 and the bird flu scares, the media seized on the very worst case scenarios, and people responded. And the worst case scenarios obviously didn't happen. And as a result, a great many people regard both threats as being largely false alarms, and they're mistrustful of anyone who sounds to them like another doom monger. Next, if you want to remain relevant to the business, then our priority is to build and maintain as good networks as you can and good working relationships in the firm, especially with areas of the business that may be called on at short notice in a crisis. Communications is an especially important area in view of what I've been saying about social media. On no account should you take on responsibility for building all the plans and keeping them up to date yourself. Quite apart from the impossible amount of work you end up with, this stops other people in the business from thinking about business continuity and internalizing it, which in turn means they don't recognize business continuity situations quickly enough when they arise. So instead, you need to aim to embed business continuity in their operational procedures where possible, making people accountable, making people responsible for and hold them accountable for their own business continuity. And finally, we need to get away from relying on department by department analysis. Use strategic business impact analysis, SBIAs, to understand the overarching business priorities based on client-related business processes and not parochial departmental priorities like reporting requirements or internal service level agreements. Make people think rather than fill in forms. So these are some ways to do what we do better and become better able to respond to unpredictable events. So now I want to look at doing things differently. And specifically, this is about raising and changing the role of business continuity professionals and taking on a broader, more strategic role. This is more of an evangelical path. And it's a path to follow if you already have influence with decision makers in the business, and a path to follow if you ever get the opportunity to influence the decision makers. And it may not be as difficult as it might initially appear, because the need to do this is what's driving the emergence of resilience as a theme in the market. But it is vital to understand that resilience is not just a rebadge from our business continuity, nor is resilience just about the various protective disciplines working together. It's worth reading the British Standard BS 65000 on organizational resilience, or getting the ISO standard 22316. The BS is perhaps a little more comprehensive than the ISO. The British Standard, is more comprehensive than the ISO, and it's aimed at informing decision makers. It's an educational document as much as anything else. The ISO is slightly narrower, but it does represent a consensus view from across the world on resilience, including US and China and everywhere. And it will be the de facto international document on the subject. There are, apologies, bear me a second. There are three areas that I want to pick out to concentrate on. These are developing an integrated networked approach to resilience. Secondly, embedding resilient thinking into corporate strategy and culture. Thirdly, making use of new technology to do some of the things that we could not do in the past. So once again, what does this mean in practice? Firstly, business continuity needs to work effectively in conjunction with other protective disciplines as part of a coordinated approach to operational resilience. This means there needs to be some form of shared governance, not necessarily shared reporting lines, but protective disciplines need to be accountable to a single point, probably the risk committee, and decisions need to be made taking into account the plans and priorities of the other protective disciplines, working together wherever necessary. To do this, you need to have a shared view of what matters most. The strategic BIA, the SBIA, together with risk appetite are the best mechanisms I've seen for achieving this. So your SBIA needs to be developed into a tool that can be used across protective disciplines to identify what really matters in the firm and why it matters. And this should be a consistent basis for prioritization for your investments. Next, we need to aspire to have more strategic influence. We touched on this in the previous slide, but we're taking it further here. Because we need to develop an understanding of what else makes an organization more or less resilient. So we need to understand the role of culture, for example, or innovation or governance, and how to improve the organization's situational awareness and so on. And these are not protective disciplines. This is as much to do with what the organization is, its character, as opposed to what the organization does. And this together is what organizational resilience is about, as defined by the standards I mentioned earlier. And following from that, we need to develop and report on key indicators and trends related to organizational resilience. The truth is that we might develop an excellent understanding of resilience ourselves, but unless you can find ways to report on this in meaningful ways, your understanding will not be shared by the business. So perhaps the single most useful thing we can do is to have a meaningful resilience dashboard that we can share with the executive. Finally, to be quite honest, I'm very cynical about most business continuity tools that I've seen on the market. There's a real need for tools that capture and analyze all the data we collect, but the existing tools have a tendency to drive a specific way of working rather than fit in with the way that you need to work. And you often end up collecting a great deal of irrelevant data and not gathering enough useful information as opposed to data. And poor tools are a big factor in the dumbing down of business continuity. Personally, I don't think that the market for business continuity tools is big enough to justify the level of investment in product development that will make them truly useful. I suspect that over time, the so-called GRC tools, which support risk and compliance activities, will supersede existing specialized business continuity tools, but these will be no better. However, despite any cynicism that you or I might feel about tools, we shouldn't close our minds to the possibilities created by new technologies. They may be a factor in increasing our vulnerability, but they might also be used to our benefit. Emerging big data technology allows us to gather and analyze vast amounts of data that organizations collect. We know that buried in that data will be all sorts of indicators and trends that point to emerging threats and point to the general health and resilience of the business. And if we can apply artificial intelligence technology to this, we should not only be able to get some early warnings of emerging issues, but also to automate some preemptive actions that will help block or contain any damage. And I really think this could be a game changer. It's like my early analogy of an autopilot, which can automatically prevent, stores and deal with situations and corrections that a pilot may never need to be aware of, but it leaves the pilots free to understand the big picture and fix meta problems. So I think I've covered a lot of ground. There's an awful lot for us to contend with, and it's clear to me that where we are is not good enough. I come back to the title of this webinar, Why Business Continuity is Failing in Our Complex Cyber World and How It Needs to Change. I do think that business continuity has in fact achieved a great deal. And if you believe that we keep on with what we've been working on, that we stay in our box, then there's still a lot more that we can do to improve. And that has a lot to do with being proactive, more proactive and less reactive. However, if we choose that path, we will be like insurance or health and safety. That is, although important and necessary, we will remain a backwater, a specialist area, rarely seen at the top table, and maybe that's okay. And to be honest, it's probably the path that most businesses will go down. But personally, I think that business continuity offers business much more than that, because uniquely business continuity looks across the whole business, and we try and determine what matters most and work out how to keep that going. And that makes it more than and different from health and safety or insurance or security or compliance for that matter. And I believe that the concept of resilience is an idea whose time has come. There is broad recognition in the market of a need to coordinate protective disciplines better and to address some of the things that makes us more resilient that are not to do with protective disciplines like culture and behaviour. And if you believe that we can be more to the business, then that second path is the one to choose. We have the opportunity, I think, to play a leading part in making businesses more resilient, and I think we should take it. Well, thank you very much for listening to me. That wraps up the formal part of the presentation. I hope it was interesting and thought-provoking for you.
On behalf of SoftExpert, thank you for the presence of everyone who participated in this event. If you have any questions, please contact the presenter via email. To see other webinars, ebooks, and white papers on this subject, please visit our website at www.softexpert.com. Find out more about SoftExpert solutions for enterprise business processes improvement, automation, corporate governance, excellence, and compliance management. Thanks for listening. See you next time.